Welcome to The Impact Effect, hosted by conscious leadership expert Tom Eddington, advisor to some of the world's most successful companies and CEOs, where each week we help executives, entrepreneurs, and organizers become more effective leaders while growing businesses that are making an impact in the world. And now, here's Tom.
Hi, welcome to the Impact Effect Network, a place where we discuss making business matter through conscious leadership. I'm Tom Eddington, host of the show, and my guest today is a colleague and dear friend, Dr. Paul Ward. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Tom. I'm really pleased to be with you today.
So, Paul, you and I have known each other for years. I'm guessing probably about a decade now. And in that time, you've written a book on conscious leadership. You've done a tremendous amount of work in the conscious leadership space. I love the work you're doing as a coach and as a leader in the Conscious Leadership Guild. Some of the things you've done in academia as a professor, I'd love to explore in a wide-ranging conversation today about what you're doing as a conscious whisperer and helping bring more conscious leadership into the world.
Yeah, that'll be great. Looking forward to it.
So let's start the conversation. I'd love for you to share a bit about how it is you came into the world of conscious leadership. You'd been doing a lot of work in the leadership space for a number of years.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I didn't set out that way. And maybe, when I look back, I think there's a phase early in life that had a huge impact. And then the last 20 years has been the sort of leadership journey, if you like. So let me just share a couple of sort of childhood experiences because I think they had a big impact on me. When I was 6 years old, I had a little brother, and he only lived 5 months. He had some congenital disease, and so he just lived 5 months. And I just have this remembrance of the white coffin, my dad carrying it to the grave. And then 18 months later, I had a sister, and my mum said when she was born, she knew that she had the same disease, and she lasted just 5 months too. And at the time, and in fact for a long time, I never really understood what the impact of that was. Yet what I found was that I really became very conscious, very aware of life and death, of love and fear. So that for me had a really big impact, but I really wasn't sure until I got to later life what impact it was. And the other issue for me when I was growing up, I grew up in a very strict religious sect where it was just built on fear. And fear, we were told you'd never survive if you left. We were the chosen ones. It was just a very fearful environment. And I just chose when I was 19 to leave. And it was a separation. I just separated from all of my friends, my family, my parents, by then I had another brother who was just 13 years younger than me. And I was just, I left. And again, that was a very conscious decision. And I think those two situations really have influenced my later life. Now, you asked about conscious leadership. For me, that was more about consciousness. This is about conscious leadership. I can trace my journey of conscious leadership back to about the year 2000. I was born in England, grew up in England, and about mid-90s, I had the opportunity to come to New York, and I've spent a lot of the last 25 years there. But in 2000, I had a very chance meeting with Richard Barrett. And Richard, he's done a lot of work on values. And I became certified as a values facilitator. And he's just been such an inspiration to me. And I went on to do a PhD with a study of leadership values, behaviors, and styles, and used full spectrum leadership, which is what Richard talks about in his 7 levels of consciousness.
Right.
And so I think, he was very influential. And then, more recently, when you and I met, and I met John Renish, we looked at future shapers, and I really started to become more aware of conscious leadership at that point. And to such an extent that I started to workshops, started coaching CEOs and senior leaders around conscious leadership. And it was only then that I realized that I had a framework that I was using. And then that was when I said, now, okay, I better write a book about it. And that really forced me to learn a lot more about conscious leadership. So there's no doubt that, they say, if you want to learn something, you should teach it. Well, if you write a book, you have to learn about it too. So that really brought me, up to the present. It was just a couple of years ago the book came out, and I've used the framework of the book, as a foundation for workshops and for conscious leadership coaching. So that's the story, both from early days and really up to today.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Paul. And you know what you and I've talked about this before, but each of us from experiences, particularly in the first 18 months of our life, but in childhood, we write our narrative for how we live our lives. And I know in the work that I do around coaching is helping leaders understand their personal narrative. And I appreciate that what you shared is you did that personal journey, that understanding your becoming more aware of who you are and what your narrative is in terms of how do you show up as a conscious leader.
Yeah, and I think that is important. I mean, a lot of what the work I do with clients is about how we show up in the world. And I think about conscious leadership with three different themes, if you like. The first is about awareness, noticing what's going on, and noticing what's going on first inside ourselves, and then beyond to outside, to others, and to the world at large. And so that's the first one, of noticing, really becoming aware. And then the second part is setting intention. And for me, setting intention, yeah, you could set objectives and goals. That's important. We need a vision and mission. Yeah, that's important. But what about how we show up in the world? So for me, this is about doing and being. And so the work I do with a lot of clients is, who do we want to be? And then, having thought about setting intention, then we get to responsible action, which is the third piece. But yeah, how we show up in the world is really critical. And I think creating the space for ourselves and for others to think about, how do we want to be in the world? That's really important.
Thanks for sharing that, Paul. So I love the awareness piece and the intention and the action. And I'm just going to ask you, with your experience and with that framework and what you've written in your book, how do you define conscious leadership when you're working with folks, and how do you define it for yourself?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, I guess. The first part is conscious, or consciousness, which is perhaps something I've been focusing on recently. And I've been looking for a definition of consciousness, and because it takes us into the world of neuroscience. And I was listening to a great film over the weekend on David Bohm, who's done some really some interesting stuff in quantum field theory. And it's not something I fully understand, but I'm curious about it. But I don't go there with clients. So I try to make it a little bit more simple. So when I think about consciousness, I really think about, it as a state of being awake and aware of what's going on. Awake and aware of what's going on. And that's really where, when I think about the first section in the book, which is the first practice, is about noticing what's going on. And that's about awareness. It really is important. So with that in mind, then where does leadership take us? And for me, setting intention is that first part. And a big part of that is purpose. Why am I here? Why am I a leader? And so that whole area of setting intention is about being clear about what our purpose is. Also thinking about possibilities. We talk about positive thinking. I like to think about possibility thinking. What's possible in the situation? So that's this whole idea of setting intention and then acting responsibly. And it's not just about acting, it's not about doing, but taking responsible action. And that's in part of our way we speak. So speaking candidly, acting with integrity, and then really taking action that's responsible. And that's the way I like to think about conscious leadership. And as you said, I mean, awareness, intention, action, AIA. And that's the sort of simple way that I help clients, is to get them very clear on what they're aware of, help them get very clear on terms of their intentions. And we do work on vision and mission and purpose, have a leadership manifesto that we work on. And then we look at, okay, what action are we going to take? For example, once we've noticed something, we've set the intention, what are we going to do? What action are we going to take? But start with setting intention about how we want to show up.
Well, you mentioned trust and fear earlier, and when I hear you talk about possibility, to me it implies that an individual has to have a high level of trust that in the end everything will work out, everything will be okay.
Yes, I like to think about confidence. And for me, confidence is that belief in ourselves, belief in our own capabilities, belief that we can deliver. And so that's the trust in ourselves, I think. Yeah, we have to trust the situation, but we have to have trust in ourselves before we can then have trust in others. So yeah, that's really is important. So when I think about, the work I do is about raising consciousness. But why raise consciousness? Well, what I'm looking to do with clients is to raise their confidence. And if we can get higher levels of confidence, we can become more confident in ourselves. We can trust ourselves, trust what we can do. And then, we can move into action and deliver the higher performance that we all seek to do. So yeah, raising consciousness gives us that higher levels of confidence before we get to higher levels of performance.
Well, I love the framework you use in your book, and you've started to talk about the first part of the book, but maybe for the benefit of our listeners and viewers who haven't had a chance to read your book, I'd like to spend a little bit of time just walking through each of the chapters, because I think there's some really important lessons and tools and resources for folks there.
Yeah. Well, there are 10 practices. We probably won't be able to dig into them too much today, but there are a few that I really enjoy working with clients on. The first three practices are listening with all the senses, learning relentlessly, and living mindfully. Those are the three practices of noticing what's going on. And so listening with all the senses is really being more attentive. We can listen with more than our ears. We know that when something happens, someone says something to us, there's something often changes in our bodies. We get those goosebumps, the tension rises, all sorts of things happen. Can we notice that? And so really noticing is really important. And the second practice is learning relentlessly. And that's, for me, is important too. Learn from everything and be curious. And then the whole idea of living mindfully is, I have a mindfulness practice. I do have a meditation practice. A lot of clients are starting to do that more. So I encourage clients to take a purposeful pause, a moment of mindfulness. Always start my coaching sessions with a minute silence. And you would be surprised how when people come into these coaching sessions and we start to do that, I know they're a bit curious, but then after a couple of weeks, they look forward to it. It's a transition from whatever they were doing just to take that moment of mindfulness. Notice what's coming up, just be present, and then we can dive into the coaching. So, a whole area of living more mindfully is really important. So those are the first three practices anyway. I don't know whether that raises another question, but we can go into the next ones as well.
Well, for me, what I appreciated when I read your book was not just the practical nature of your writing, but I one of the things I admire and respect about you is the academic rigor that you bring to all of your work. And so I've appreciated that there's the academic rigor as well as the practical nature to what you've written about. And I'm just curious, and we'll start with these first three. Um, they're seemingly so simple, and yet folks don't do them as part of their daily practice. And what do you find is sort of behind that with the clients you work with?
I think a lot of it is just the pace of work these days, that we don't stop and just take a breath and see what's needed. We rush from one thing to another. And for me, that's the message. We need to stop.
Mm.
And I use that STOP mnemonic. S is for stop. The T is for take a breath. The O is for observe what's going on. And P is proceed. So just a simple message. And you said, I mean, they really are simple, but they're not easy to implement. And so for me, it is about encouraging leaders to take time out, take a pause, just let the mind go for a moment, and then show up in a much more calm and present way.
And what do you notice when you start working with leaders? How long does it take them for this to become a daily practice?
Well, of course, that depends on the leader, and some never get there. There's a lot of resistance, but others really have embraced this practice of meditation, of starting the day with meditation, of creating that purposeful pause, knowing that they're rushing to a meeting. And today, of course, so much is on the screen. We rush from one meeting to another, click the screen, and we're back into a new meeting. I find that if clients really stop and just create the space between those sessions, to take a moment, take a breath, even close the eyes, and it only takes a few seconds, really, a minute, sometimes a few minutes, but just creating that time. If we do that, then that practice can very quickly, within days, people start to notice that it's valuable. And so once it becomes valuable, then people will take it on. It's got to be worthwhile. And once people appreciate it, then they can start to practice. And habits, well, a lot of people say habits take 21 days. There's other research that 60 days. Well, I like it to be a practice. And I think conscious leadership is a practice. For me, it's not a destination. I mean, that's what it's about. It's about a journey. But it is about practicing the elements of conscious leadership.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Paul. The metaphor I often use with the leaders I work with is if you watch a juggler, whether they're juggling balls or knives or torches on fire, if you've never done any juggling before, it looks amazing, and you see these objects that are going around, and for each of us, metaphorically, we talk about juggling all the different things in our lives. And yet, when you look at the juggler, there's all of this space in between the objects that are being juggled. And I remind my clients that whether it's a contemplative practice or stopping as you're describing, just to focus on that space between the objects as opposed to the 3, the 6, the 8 objects that are being juggled at any given time.
Yeah, I love the juggling metaphor. I think the other part of that is, in fact, I was reading this the other day. If you are, particularly when you're learning to juggle, and believe me, I'm no juggler, but I know how to do it. But if you're focused on keeping those 3 balls in the air or whatever you're doing, then your mind is really focused on that juggling. And all of the other distractions they're gone.
Hmm.
Because the moment there's a distraction is the moment you drop the ball. And for me, that's the same practice for leaders, is to really get away from the distractions and become really attentive to what's going on. And if it's a conversation, be very attentive just to that conversation and take away the distractions. If we can get rid of the distractions, and there are many, then yeah, we can become better leaders very quickly.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Who you are is how you lead. Conscious leadership is an intuitive, intentional process requiring an open heart, an open mind, and a committed desire to fully own how you show up in the world. If you're a CEO, a solopreneur, or a community leader, Tom Eddington's ebook helps you amplify your strengths, making you the best version of yourself. Download the ebook today and become a part of bringing conscious leadership to the planet.
So let's move on to the next set of practices and what you have in the book.
Yeah, so the second theme, if you like, is around setting intention. So, and first of all, it's exploring purposefully. And for me, purpose is just a really important place to start. I love to follow Simon Sinek, who wrote that book and talks all the time about start with why. And so for me, it's very important to know purpose. And maybe I can just share my own purpose development. One of the things that I've done over the years is to become a hot air balloon pilot. I think you knew that.
Yeah.
And, there's a long story about how I got into that. But when I moved to New York, I was flying in England. When I moved to New York, I shipped my balloon over, and I actually created a ballooning business there. And so I was traveling during the week. At the weekend, I'd be up taking passengers for rides. And on my website and on my business card, it said taking people higher, or maybe it was taking you higher. Just a simple strap line. And so I was working with a purpose coach a few years ago, really trying to get my mind around, so what is my purpose? And after a few weeks of working on vision, mission, and purpose, we extended that taking people higher and the requirement was 10 words or less, purpose statement of 10 words or less. So I took taking people higher and just added in spirit, in business, and in life. So taking people higher in spirit, in business, and in life, 10 words. And I've used that as a sort of a test. Is what I'm doing today taking people higher in some way? And I work with clients to help them define a purpose for themselves, something that they'll always remember, something that they can test their actions against. And so for me, purpose is a very important place to start. The next practice is about possibility thinking. So we talked a little bit about that, but that's that belief that something is possible rather than, and this is a natural state for me, I'm a pessimist. So, I often thought, well, I couldn't do that. And yet with possibility thinking, it's surprising what we can achieve. And then the third practice of that theme is committing to action. And, that's the bridge between setting intention and acting responsibly. And, the challenge of committing to action, we've got lots of experience of commitments. The challenge is actually converting those into action. And so getting very clear about our intentions, about how we show up, but also those goals and objectives, the vision and mission and purpose, all of those things, which for me is part of my Conscious Leadership Manifesto, really is a practice that gets me to bridge towards the place of acting responsibly.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Paul, and once again, thank you for writing the book. I know it's made a huge contribution to leadership development in the area of conscious leadership in particular. Can you talk a bit about what are you seeing thematically with the clients you're working with, the organizations you're working with? What have you noticed has shifted in the world of conscious leadership and leadership in general, and with what's happening in the world?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously in the last few months, things have shifted. And what's difficult, I think, is to know what shifted as a result of this pandemic and what's, just shifting because it is shifting. Uh, for some of the clients, they're dealing with day-to-day work. I have a client in the supply chain. He's vice president of supply chain. And if I was talking to him on Friday, and his challenge is all about his distribution center. It's all about it's the regular operating challenges. But the other part is all to do with people. The people issues have not changed. How we manage people. And I was listening to your interview with Bob Chapman the other day. I mean, I love Bob Chapman. His philosophy is just so resonates with me about, how we serve people. And so I think that's the key. And I think some of that has changed through this pandemic where, so many people are now working remotely. So instead of being able to sit down over a cup of coffee or, in the office or just to be able to chat over issues, people are having to do that, via the computer. And that's not easy. I was talking to someone the other day who has one of his team has a performance issue. And he's saying he won't be back in the office probably this year. And yet he still has to deal with these people issues, these performance issues. And I think that's the challenge that a lot of leaders are facing. And again, what I try to do is to come back to taking a pause, being aware, noticing what's going on, and being very clear about how we want to show up. So those practices are relevant. And I think however long this pandemic is going to go on, as I say, I was talking to someone who's got this performance management issue. He doesn't think he's going to be back in his office till the end of the year, maybe beyond that. And so although a lot of people are getting back into their office, a lot of people are not. And the lack of personal contact, not face to face on the screen, but being able to sit down and have a conversation. Zoom is great. It's great to have these video conferences. It really, can't imagine this pandemic without these videos, but it's not the same as being able to sit down in front of someone in person. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges that leaders face today, as well as all of the, the operational challenges that they have. I really think it's about people.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed is that when people were physically going to a workspace, it was very easy for their employer, for their managers, for the leaders to just subconsciously say, "You're in the workplace now. I only see you as an employee. I only see you as somebody who's here to execute on a task that I've given you or I'm expecting of you." And because people are working remotely, they're working from home, that barrier, that boundary between the personal private life and the professional life has dissolved. And I'm finding that there's a level of humanity, there's a level of connection, there's a level of inquiry around who are you as a person that's starting to show up in a way that I think for many leaders is uncomfortable for them. It's unfamiliar to them. And I'm curious to see what you've noticed in that regard.
Yes, and I think of conscious leadership. We haven't talked about this element of it, but I see conscious leadership about being more caring and compassionate. And I do notice that that's starting to happen, that people are realizing that you can't just jump on a call and start talking. And when we do that in the coffee room or, at the beginning of a meeting, we know someone, how are the kids, how's this, how's that. But I think what this pandemic has done for some, not all, but for some, is to make them just be a little bit more aware and to be a little bit more compassionate and take time out at the beginning. Not only one-to-one conversations, but in groups, just to allow a little bit of personal check-in, just to show that care and compassion. Because people working at home, it's all right for me. I work from home, and it's all quiet here. It's a great location. But others are working on their dining room table with the kids running in and out. It's challenging. And so I think that whole aspect of becoming more caring, to become more compassionate about what's going on in the lives of our colleagues, I think there is a shift there. And I'm hoping that that will continue as we return, which I hopefully we will soon, and some people already are, but return to that physical space.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network, the world's first 24-hour on-demand business and leadership video and podcast network, bringing conscious leadership to a global audience.
And maybe more broadly, what are you observing? What are you seeing around? I'll call it the evolution of human consciousness, and particularly in the workplace and with leadership.
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm fortunate to be part of a number of different groups where I have a lot of optimism about what's happening. And just to share, I'm part of a sacred change makers society. I'm part of Terry Patton's New Republic of the Heart. Conscious Leadership Guild is another one of those groups, one of those circles. And there's just so many people there who are really being attentive to what's going on in the world, very, very caring about the planet. Obviously, we've got issues around politics, which I try not to get into, but there are so many issues that are being faced. And what I'm finding is that more and more, and maybe this is the circles I'm involved in, I'm finding people who are taking time out to really think about the future of our planet and what needs to be done. I don't necessarily see that in business. I mentioned Richard Barrett earlier on. The Barrett Value Center did an interesting study early on in this lockdown, and just looking at the values that people had seen and what was likely to happen, what was changing. And there were some shifts in there, but one of the concerns that they were expressing was because we have to face some challenging situations and financial challenges, no doubt about that, because income is dropped for a lot of companies. What about sustainability? A lot of organizations are really focused on sustainability, but that study suggested that that's going to have sort of fall a little bit by the wayside as we have to refocus on just rebuilding businesses after this pandemic. So, for me, in my circles, I'm finding more and more people that are interested. I'm not seeing it so much yet in many of the organizations.
Well, maybe to that point, I mean, you and I've had this conversation before, and you've referenced it here in this conversation about personally, you're a pessimist, and yet so much of what you do is bringing hope and hopefulness into organizations and with leaders. And how do you reconcile that?
I've been fortunate. I have a lot of good teachers over the years. And I remember back in the 80s, I was working with McDonnell Douglas. And I remember an annual performance review where my senior leader, who was an American, very candid, made the point about my negativity. And I really appreciate that he did, because, that was 30 plus years ago, and it stuck with me. And what I've done since then is to be very careful to just take a few risks. I mean, people who knew me back in the 80s were really surprised when I went and bought a share in a hot air balloon. Crazy thing to do. But for me, I've taken that sort of strategy of, okay, do something different. take a little bit of a risk and look a lot more, as you say, hopefully more positively. And I've made that a conscious practice. And I don't think I would have necessarily done that had my supervisor, if you like, at McDonnell Douglas pointed that out to me. And again, it's a conscious practice for me. I can get very negative, and to be honest, during this pandemic, about week 3 or 4 into the lockdown, I had some real panic attacks, some real anxiety. And, I had to get through that. And I did, but it took me a couple of weeks. And so, yeah, I think it's a conscious plan to say, I'm going to show up differently. And I think that's, for me, is really critical, that we show up and show up with a positive possibility thinking outlook. That's the way I've managed it. And it's given me that confidence, if you like. Talked about confidence earlier. Given me the confidence to take those risks, to be bold, and to step out there.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Paul. And as we both do in our work, we encourage our clients, and we personally try and be vulnerable and be willing to open up and share what's going on. And I found certainly in the last 4 or 5 months, as my thoughts have drifted into some what I'll call pretty difficult neighborhoods, that having that contemplative practice, having that daily practice of meditation and being in nature has helped me be an observer to my thoughts, to being an observer to some of my consciousness and my negative thoughts that have shown up in my daily life.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to create those spaces. I was on a call earlier on today with someone in Germany, someone I've got to know this year, never met, but I've got to know over these video conferences. And he lives near the forest, and he does a daily walk in the forest. And he was just talking about, he'd just come back for when we started our call. And he talked about it as his soul walk. His soul walk. And, he's talked about this for me before. And, he goes and spends time in the forest. And he was saying, today it's a beautiful day in Germany. It's very calm wind. And he said he just stood there and listened. And, there was just silence, except for 2 or 3 birds, he said. And so we do need to find that wherever we are, and I live, wherever I am, either in England or in Florida, where I am part of the time, I live by the sea. And for me, that's my place, just to be by the sea and take quiet walks and just take the time to be present. And I often talk about, this is not original from me, but often talk about taking a question for a walk. I think about a question and on my walk, and I just take that as a reflection. And it really is important to create those spaces. For me, I love to walk, and so I take those walks at least once a day. And if not, I can sit quietly. I find meditation challenging. I have distracted mind, so I know that. But I do find that getting out into nature, or if it's by the beach or in the forest, wherever that is, that can be really helpful.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Is your team tuned out? Are you looking for a powerful speaker to motivate and inspire your organization? Then Tom Eddington is the choice for keynote speaker at your next conference or event. Tom is one of the most sought-after business advisors and coaches in Silicon Valley. For over 2 decades, Tom has advised world-renowned CEOs and executives on how to catapult their organization's success, including Hewlett-Packard, NBNA Corporation, and Royal Dutch Shell. In his dynamic keynotes, Tom offers fresh new paradigms on how to create healthier, happier, and more purposeful workplaces while navigating change and generating higher degrees of success for organizations. For information on booking Tom at your next event, contact eddingtonadvisory.com.
Well, there's the vulnerability piece too, which is to acknowledge it, be aware of it, and be open to sharing it with others in our lives. And I find that being able to just open up and share creates an invitation for them to be willing to open up and share as well.
Yes, it's interesting. I've been involved in circles, that over the years, and convened sessions. It's just something I love to do, is to convene conversations that matter. And I love to be able to sit in a circle and be present to everybody. In the last 6 months, it's been, via Zoom. One of the values there, of course, is that we can have small breakouts. So, one of the groups I'm involved in has 200 members. And quite often on Wednesdays, there are over 100 people on a Zoom call. But we break out into small groups of 3 or 4. And those become very intimate if you let it happen. And so I think it really is important. I love this thought about vulnerability. It's important to be authentic, to show up, but also being vulnerable, I think, can really help us, for me anyway, just to get up out of my anxiety periods.
Well, I'm curious, Paul, with with all of the work you've done in academia and writing and the coaching work you're doing, what's next for Paul, and what are you focusing on in terms of bringing more conscious leadership into the world and supporting the conscious leadership that is showing up?
Yeah, so the next big project, I say next because we're right in the middle of it. I've been working with people, coaching people in transition, particularly those. I have a business called Too Young to Retire. And so I've been helping people transition from their full-time careers into what comes next. And so this whole idea of consciousness has been sort of on the top of my mind. And so what I've been doing recently is to start to integrate, to unify is the word I've been using, some of the work I've been doing under the banner of consciousness. And so the new project is actually a new book with a working title of Conscious Living in the Second Half of Life. And it's a great project. I'm working with 2 other authors. And this is an interesting venture. The first book I wrote was on my own. This is a group of 3 of us. We have the chapter outlines done. We're meeting with an editor next week, in fact. And I'm really looking forward to actually doing the writing. We have started to write, but it's a big project. And so for me, what I find is that I often work with leaders who are developing their skills and are becoming better leaders. And there are others who are at that stage of life where they want to make a change. I have a client who was in the pharmaceutical industry, was general counsel, and he wanted to make a shift. He was ready. He was financially got to that place where he thought he could retire. And he was ready to make a transition out of 80 hours a week working for a pharmaceutical company into something that turned out to be a not-for-profit where he was working to support children. And so that transition, I worked with him for about 6 months. And again, we started with purpose. What's his purpose in life? And so those transitions are really important. So yes, a lot of it is conscious leadership, but it's also conscious living. And so that both of those are really important. And for a lot of the leaders I'm working with, they're looking forward now to say, so where am I going to be? How can I make a difference? Not just in my career, but as the career comes to an end and I look for something else, where can I make a difference in the world? And that transition, that's this conscious living in the second half of life, I think is a real opportunity for people to do things. And I talk about doing the work because they want to, not because they have to. We have to go to work to pay the bills. But if we're careful and we plan well, we can get to that stage where we can make some more conscious choices about how we're going to spend our time. And conscious living says I can make some choices and make a difference in the world. And there's a lot of people making some great difference in the world.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a delight being in conversation with you today. And I would just ask, what's the one thing you'd like folks to take away from our show today?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It's been a real pleasure. I come back, I think, to what we were talking about earlier about awareness, intention, and action. It's a very simple, it's very easy to remember. Stop, become more aware, set a clear intention, and then take responsible action. And as I say, AIA is just a very simple 3 letters. Not easy to do, but if we can stop and take those 3 letters, become more aware, set a clear intention about how we want to show up, and then take responsible action, I think we can make a difference in the world.
And for people who want to find out more about your work and what you're doing, or to get in touch with you, what's the best way for folks to reach out to you?
Well, a couple of ways. You mentioned the book. We talked a lot about the book today. theconsciousleadershipbook.com is the book website, and you can always reach me there. And my other website is drpaulward.com, drpaulward.com, drpaulward.com. Great place to go and learn a little bit more about my philosophy of life. A lot of what we talked about today can be found there. There's an interesting little download which is built around the practice of AIA. Again, you can contact me through those websites.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's always a pleasure being in conversation with you, and I really appreciate you being on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great pleasure, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you again in person one of these days.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul, and take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You're watching the Impact Effect Network. Thank you for joining Tom Eddington on the Impact Effect. Visit impacteffectnetwork.com to connect with Tom and discover additional episodes featuring today's top leaders making a global impact through conscious leadership in the world today.